Hello, and welcome to the last panel of the conference, Conclusions and Departures. With me, I have Ranjit and Ravi, the two co-conveners of the conference, along with Rahul and Amitanshu, who have been part of the first day of the proceedings. I mean, the idea now is to, like, we've had some fantastic discussions, and what we want to look at is how these 3 days will reflect in the next few months when we take State of Nature through its different forms of an exhibition, of literature events, and so on and so forth. So to begin with, what I would like both Ranjit and Ravi to do is actually talk about the scope of the project a little bit, because we have so many things going on, and we've also been doing this project now for more than 2 years. Actually, 2018, let's forget COVID, because, you know, a lot of things didn't happen, but this is its third iteration, and, you know, it would be good, I think, for the audiences to know the scope of it. So, which one?
Thank you, Amruta, and thank you for organizing and providing the forum and being at the center of this 2.5 years of very productive work. From my perspective, and I'm sure Ranjit will add his, the idea was to open up the word nature in all possible ways. And that was the drive for the 2018 conference, which we called it interdisciplinary. But I think when we talk interdisciplinary, I also use the word extradisciplinary, because we also go beyond, above and beyond disciplines and find new connections. And I think the idea that the word nature is so expansive and so much underpins everything we can think of, scientifically, socially, historically, that the only way I think to think about it and put it back together differently is to first unpack it in all possible ways. And that means that all of us, and everybody has something to say about it, because it is within the human realm of every individual, but it doesn't mean the same thing. So that's also a political question from my perspective, and that effort stays on till now. As you can see in the last conference, this particular conference, which we are concluding today, the kind of panels put together and the kind of perspectives have been essentially to open up the conversations and then think of how we rethink it. And the exhibition, which is in the same premise and downstairs, is again positions, artistic positions. So that was the first thing. The second is, which is very important to me, is the inclusion of who we call artists in this thing. Because I'm particularly keen on being a practicing artist myself, keen on the role artists play, which is not to just reproduce something, but to actually propose something, because I think that's the possibility of art. Because you really are, when you're talking of proposals and futures, you're talking of imaginations and linkages, which hitherto we have not, may not have thought of. And I think that, of course, we talk of the present and our view of the past from the present, as Ashish Nandi puts it, and the future we propose through the present. So the present conflates everything, the past and the future, but also then thinking of the future in terms of new possibilities and new imaginations. So this is a realm of artists of all sorts. This is where I think art begins, when we are in the world of the imagination and the world of thinking something differently. And I think all forms of art begin from this point of the imagination. So that was the endeavor, and in that sense, this is just the beginning of the endeavor, because we've just managed to unpack things in some ways, and many more unpackings are possible. What happens in the future, we don't know.
It's really been profoundly illuminating and exciting to have heard all of the voices that we invited and to receive, I think, the generosity of these perspectives and these journeys. Because for me, there were at least two aspects to being part of the State of Nature project with Ravi, having been his fellow traveler and fellow pilgrim in other contexts. I think one major aspect of this was how to bear witness to all of these urgencies across a range of experiences. And it's important, I think, to accept that this can no longer be something confined to expert culture and dictated from the high ground of policy, which usually ends up just compounding the disaster. I think the question for me was also whether it's artists or anthropologists, geographers, poets, all of the diverse practitioners that we brought together, how is this seismic turbulence felt in these different domains, and how might people learn from each other? I think for me that's always been crucial in various things I've done, whether it's been in cultural organizing or in literature. I think it's crucial to produce spaces of encounter where very dissimilar languages and disciplines come together and there's a possibility of dialogue and people go away transformed. I don't think that's a one-way process. And there's an attraction that form holds for me, whether it's the exhibition here, the conference, the literary events that are going forward. I think they remind us of the importance of the coalition. And I want to emphasize that because we are increasingly, it's almost as if we're back in the 1930s. There's a bizarre sense that all good things will only proceed when you have the strong authoritarian figure, a complete unity of purpose, and a complete annihilation of opposition and dissent and resistance. This is nonsense, and it has catastrophic results. So for me, it's important to maintain the sanctity and the value of the coalition, of a polyphony of dissent, or at least a polyphony of diverse voices. And to my mind, this project is, however modest it might be, it's a contribution to that. And it also reminds me, I've increasingly fallen into the habit of memoiristic reflection. But it just took me back to a completely different part of my life, which I'm increasingly thinking of as my Buddhist phase, where someone was shaped by a far more, if you will, revolutionary leftist perspective, meeting with Buddhist practitioners and appreciating the kinds of ameliorative politics that they were involved with was very, very important. This was the late 1990s. I should actually acknowledge some of these teachers. Dhamachari Lokamitra, born Jeremy Goody, Rajeshwari's father, as it happens. It was very, very important to spend time with him in Pune, in Bombay, elsewhere, and to understand what it meant to be part of a people's movement that was not premised on systematic destruction of the other. What might possibilities of dialogue be like? What might the possibilities of self-transformation be like? Does one always have to completely destroy the other to assert oneself? What is the spectrum of human possibilities? I think there was a lot that I learned there. Also from another Buddhist teacher, Sulak in those years, was the sense that you cannot have these adventures of the religious imagination or of mystical journeys without recognizing that you are ultimately part of a larger social formation which is shaped by structural violence. So this dynamic of how to deal with your own self-realization in whatever form, whilst not turning away from structural violence, I think is also something that flows with me, and which I think is something that many of us around this table are exercised by. And that's come through again and again, which is why, in one sense, it's been, and I do hope that we have auditors, interlocutors who will rise to the challenges that were posed in every one of our panels in these days. Because in the last iteration of State of Nature, remember Ravi and I have talked about this, it was very sad and disconcerting to come across a certain kind of metropolitan elite understanding of what environmental activism means, as if there was a one-size-fits-all notion of, separate your garbage and look upon plastic with suspicion and you're fine. And to that kind of sensibility, it came as a big shock to realize that ecological reality is conceived differently depending on your social location or your political access, that a Dalit person does not see these things in the same way as you might from your place of privilege do. Or what does it mean to be alienated from your own environment by militarization, as happens in the Northeast, in Jammu and Kashmir, in a whole range of spaces. So again, this notion of how these questions should be approached in granularity is something that was vital to me as a contributor to this process. And thus, moving on to the question of how do you speculate and imagine futures, plural futures, otherwise. And we're sort of, I was going to say, we've turned this into an informal, and in the case of Rahul and Amitangshu, an involuntary editorial conference. But it would be nice to see this session in that spirit also, to see how we take this constellation or montage of discussions forward, so that we do not only resist and critique what should be resisted and critiqued, but we also point forward to possibilities of hope, strategies of doing otherwise, and maintaining this coalitionary conversation.
Yeah, I think the one immediate thing that this conference has done is just sort of given you a sense of the scope of this conversation, because I think all of us approach it from our own particular understanding, like exactly what you said, that most people look at it as recycling and that's enough to do about it, but not understanding that your idea of nature would be different from somebody else's and his from others. So I think that's one thing, and I'm pretty sure that all our speakers also gained a lot of different perspectives from each other. So with that, since Rahul and Amitanshu have agreed to be part of the panel, I'd just like to ask them what they have felt through these last 2 days and, their ideas.
Thanks. We have been volunteered, as we say in classrooms sometimes. So, when Ranjit was talking about this and Ravi earlier, I was thinking, where would hope come from? And sometimes I believe we look for hope in very distant places, like a star shining at us and we look at it. Sometimes hope comes from from intimate surroundings. And I have tremendous respect for Anupam Mishra, who passed away. He was a very well-known writer and environmental activist, though he would not call himself that perhaps. And he used to say something, "Chote-chote kaam karte raho." Do small things, keep doing it. Do not worry about how it scales, where it goes, but keep doing it. And the other hope for me comes from my own father, who has been an editor of a little magazine in Calcutta for the last 56 years. And if you go to the little magazine scene in West Bengal, what truly amazed me, the amount of Dalit literature that has come up through the little magazine scene, it's just mind-boggling. That space has, really grown. And my father says that survival sometimes was the biggest victory, because the forces that are acting on you are so big and so violent, even to survive is a challenge. So I was very taken by what Ruth Badel said, and she said that the state of nature depends on the nature of the state, which I thought was really haunting the way she put it. And what happens when you have a state which is a corporatist, casteist, capitalist state? And I was wondering about this too. Bhrigupati Singh talked about change of diets with the kind of crops that were being grown, rice and wheat, and he talked about aspiration. I was also thinking there's a Brahminism there. Rice and wheat become Brahmin crops. Millets become Dalits. They're erased from the landscape. Their culture, their heritage it's just kind of marginalized. And this is done through the state. The state makes rice and wheat available in every PDS shop, in every form, which also creates that aspiration for it. And that homogenization has a huge impact on the ecology that we deal with today. We are looking at that. Rice, wheat, and sugarcane has completely altered the ecological regime and made it very fragile. Similarly, when we talk about other forms of knowledge systems, Mukul is a big inspiration and his book is amazing. And when you look at caste and nature, I think we also now need to look at how dams and embankments and other kinds of engineering that happens is produced through casteist violence, because that is also a form of knowledge coming through certain Brahminical traditions which is intersected with colonial legacies. So it's happening on both sides. So we need to start unpacking this violence that's taking place, because we've talked about slow violence, but there's other kinds of this corporatist, casteist, capitalist violence. And the struggle against that, I think, is in small things, where something like this, which brings together people doing different kinds of things together, I think there's a lot of hope in there. We inspire each other, and that's a good way to begin. That's all.
Thanks.
So first of all, I'm very thankful to Ranjit and Ravi for having us all for past 3 days. Doing in person seems like a wonder moment for me. One way to think through the panels in past 3, and one always looks at someone else's work through one's own work, right? So the constant engagement that I've had with different people presenting on plethora of subjects was through my own work that I've been trying to do. And I was thinking about this today. Laura Ogden has this wonderful book called Loss and Wonder at the World's End. And she talks about how loss as much as becomes a site of disappearance, and it could be a person, place, and landscape, but it also becomes a site for inviting a lot of fortification, re-engineering. And since I've been thinking about loss, pain, grief far more than I've ever done, I think this conference sort of brought together several fabrics of grief that coexist without necessarily in conflict with each other. And that could be the grief that's been witnessed by the landscape itself. So, you know, coming down of a glacial, hanging glacier in Upper Himalayan area in Chamoli, to those who it runs over, the laborers who are mostly migrant, precarious, and often from low caste. And it informs you a certain level in which that we have to start using grief as a political imagination and not necessarily only as an affective, not affective, but emotional response. And in that sense, each one of the papers that may have spoken from their own vantage point with thick research has allowed me to think more broadly about how we craft a narrative of crisis and who is privileged in that narrative, who gets assigned a certain narrative of grief and pain, and who gets excluded from it. And therefore, thinking of crisis more affectively than simplistic causal effect narrative, right? And this is not to say people who are doing causal effect work are not important, but to open up more venues to understand the crisis from a more affective point of view. So it's been a great learning curve for me as a young scholar, but also very great opportunity to be here and to learn from Ranjit's work. I've been thoroughly inspired by, so it's a great opportunity.
No, I think this one word that keeps coming up in this conference quite regularly has been imagination. Seriously. I mean, I think for me, this conference has definitely triggered my imagination about nature. Thinking about it in different ways that I've never thought was even possible. But then I realized that imagination also plays a very critical role in all your practices. I mean, you're all multidisciplinarians, and so I just would like to ask each one of you what your take on imagination is, because I think
Let's start with
This evening is panning out a little difficult. So, I mean, what do we think of as, how do we conceptualize imagination? So, when I kind of look at, there is an agreement, I guess, across the board here, that there is definitely a certain lack or a denial of imagination on how we perceive nature. And how is that denial of imagination taking place? There are large structural forces shaping it. So I wonder, can imagination be a political project? Can we try to create a movement that pushes or at least nudges these forces to imagine things differently? Can they imagine nature differently? What would we need to do that? I think that's something that that is what I'm trying to imagine here. That what is that would make that difference? Because we are looking at nature with a certain imagination, but that imagination seems to be completely at odds with the way a lot of other people seems to be looking at it. So how do we align this? Given the political economic barriers that are there and the interests that are entrenched, that is why I find, I kind of really, that whole discussion that happened yesterday on art and its ability to connect imaginations. The art, poetry, how can it kind of bring together people who may not be agreeing to it, but it kind of appeals to them in a frame which is outside the political economy frame of imagination, emotion. Can we now, because, okay, I'm just probably going to rant a little bit now, but the thing is, we are in a data-saturated environment. We have so much data on climate change, and yet there are people who believe climate change is not happening. So maybe the time has come to look at imagination that takes the root of emotion to kind of connect with people, rather than, I'm not denying at any point of time we need evidence, but something's not working. And I think that's when imagination plays a very big role.
I'm up next. Okay. Likewise, for me too, I feel that I think the imagination is always a political project, and that's why what Brigu said yesterday resonated strongly for me when he talked about his engagement increasingly with romanticism. Because I think too often, thanks to a certain kind of pedagogy that domesticates romanticism, and you tend to think of these guys as idle daydreamers, I think we forget the degree to which all the great romantics, whether in Germany or in Britain or in France, were deeply concerned with experiences of the dramatic attack on nature, on vulnerable communities, on the marginal. So it wasn't just daffodils, it was also the enclosures, the expulsion of people from their habitats, the loss of livelihood. Romanticism was a profoundly political project. So in that spirit, I also think that we need to commit ourselves to this way of imagining otherwise and to finding languages. I think that for me has been a key strand through these 3 days. In one form or another, this question of how to convey these experiences and insights in multiple languages or registers, if you will. I think that's a major concern. Might that be poetry? Might it be song? Might it be other forms of art, of creative engagement? I think we're being called upon to translate this crisis in ways that appeal to the people who we want to bring into the discussion. So for me, that is, without in any way reducing the imagination to an instrument, and that's a terrible mistake that has happened at various points in history. But I think we need to really acknowledge this power of the imagination, but also to see how, in a broader sort of way, we can restore it to pedagogy. I think it's an aspect that's absent, not only in the teaching of literature, the teaching of everything. I think we just do not privilege curiosity, the imagination. Ravi and I were talking also a little while ago about why Indians particularly seem to be afraid to speculate. There seems to be an overriding reliance on the status quo, on what seems well achieved and sanctified by expert culture, but there is very little appetite for speculating on the future and moving forward with the human adventure.
For me, imagination there's an impericity in imagination in a contradictory way. I think for me, I mean, we were talking about hope just some time back. We talked about, and so I'll just metaphorically phrase that and might help in thinking what I'm thinking, understanding what I'm thinking. That I think the idea of hope is very abstract, but the idea of pain is very real. So to have hope, we have to be in the pain. When we are in the pain, then we have to understand what that pain is, and that is where the hope would come from. So it is a question of critical thinking and critical analysis. And for me, imagination is an extension of that. Because look at our state right now, when we talk of the idea of nature. Somehow, of course, there are many phrases which we can use, but from my perspective, there's a certain kind of loss of the idea of experience of nature. So we can define it in capital or technical, you know, so many words are floating around, but there is a certain denial of loss of experience, and that might be different from person to person. That's how I came into nature, through walking the forest in my early teens. And I remember those experiences, or growing up in my grandfather's house in Rajasthan in the bare Thar desert. And it's left a deep imprint about my idea of how I smell the earth, how I see landscape, or how I have a feeling of being not alone in barrenness. And these have deeply imprinted and shaped the way I think about everything right now, my emotional impulses. So why have we done that? Why have we left this experience of being in nature, of whatever nature means, behind? The second thing, I think there has been such a technical category of the nature created, and we are overburdened by the technical characteristic of the idea of nature. So you look at any global debate on nature, if it's not technically characterized, it's non-existent. So it means that the Anthropocene has to be technically characterized for it to be a legitimate geophysical term. It's still not accepted, but it's in the process. Or climate change has to be in terms of degrees and quantums of carbon in the air before we can say there is climate change. What that means is that or you look at circular economy, you know, which is the most current debate about the future of sustainability. Current circular economy has no relationship to people. It talks of materials, as if materials have ever existed on the planet without the interaction with people. It's one of the fundamental relationships we've had with the world is materials. How we've shaped them, how we've used them, how we've inhabited them. So there has been this separation, and I think it's both value-based separation, which also takes away experience, an affective idea of nature, but also it is a separation which serves different political interests, you know. So these two things sort of go together, and they lead to a certain kind of alienation, I feel. The alienation is from different ways of knowing the world, which is affective, but also different ways of knowledge systems, which we have no ways to translate, or no ways to bring into our realm of thinking, or no ways to acknowledge. And as I always say, that you can call all the Indians and the forest indigenous communities to the table, but do we know what to do next? How should we leave the table? What is the conversation we are going to have? How will we understand these conversations? And what is the power equation through which we leave the table? Who will be the doer? Who will be the collaborator? These questions are fundamental questions when we bring in what we think we have lost, in a sense. So given all these kinds of things, which are structural, political, but also, as I always say, ontological, because we have somehow lost those selves which have ways of knowing the world which we don't want to acknowledge anymore, or we have no ways to translate. And these are not everything we can say easily, but a lot of the way we live our life is not said. It is just through the knowing of ourselves and the experience of living it that we do things and don't do things. That's how some decisions, many major life decisions are taken. But we don't have the language for it, or we have decided not to acknowledge that language for it. So it's a big task, but on the other hand, it's a very easy task in a sense. Just reflect and start thinking differently, and maybe that will be the beginning of the crumbling of the structures which we have, which we want to change, but I have no clue to change it. So there is this thing of another trajectory. Where should we look for the other trajectory? We should, of course, start from ourselves, because I think we all have it within us. Because the question of nature is, at the end of the day, a deeply personal one. I don't think political systems emerge out of the blue. They don't emerge from some abstract space. They emerge from real spaces within ourselves, in a sense. So, well, in a kind of Gandhian way, though I don't claim to understand Gandhi more than, I claim to understand Gandhi less than most people do, but in a sort of broadly Gandhian way, I think we need to rediscover ourselves a bit and then walk the talk with some conviction. So that's where the hope comes from, that not that we'll have a painless life, because I don't think that is the objective. But can we have something we set out to do, a less alienated life, a more equitable life, a more respectful life, where we really respect life, and also don't assert the kind of power which we do over everybody else. And I think these are unacceptable positions, I think. Not to recognize them, to play on them purposely, is a breach of social trust.
Yeah. For me, I mean, climate change, and I've said this enough elsewhere, has always been a site of crisis of imagination. So I don't think of climate change, especially the discussions with which I engage, that I find it any more disputable that it is anything but the crisis of imagination. And I say this with some degree of experience, because I grew up in a flood-hit area of Bihar, and my house literally sits on the bank of a river that flows down from Kathmandu to Darbhanga. And now I work for a project in Norway that's looking at rights of nature, where most of the things are explained. And in this process of learning and sort of coming in a full circle of life, having experienced flood while growing up as a child, to now see the discussion where climate scientists and experts are of the opinion that certain mitigation and adaptation model will help. I still find that there is something that's not been accepted on table, and I think that we're in a stage of complete denial of how rivers are, for instance, but narratives, and you will have to use relatedness as a form of generating knowledge about it. There's going to be no one meaning. It's going to be that search for singularity is causing this kind of crisis of imagination, because we constantly want to conform to something that we think is true. And I think narrative in this case, and and Ravi has beautifully summarized that affective responses are not merely experience, they're not merely footnote to something that's factual. It is the content. Narratives are the sources of content. And unless we accept narratives in differences, disputes, in warfare, in conflict, a certain area of Bihar is the opinion that there should be no embankment, while others are of the opinion there should be embankment, and they can sit together as cotangent, not necessarily conflicting. So I think if we see as climate crisis as a crisis of imagination, and then try to use narrative as a tool to intervene, I think we will get somewhere. close to a less solution-driven world, but more affectively responded. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, talking about like narratives and content, right? I mean, so this conference, the exhibition, this project over the last so many years has generated a lot of content, a lot of discussion, a lot of new ideas, and as co-conveners, co-curators, and practitioners in this field, I want to see like how do you see yourself take this content forward? And by forward, I don't just mean linear forward, but to sort of spread it out. Like how do you see this whole interdisciplinary culture production, conversations, sort of like, you know, open up the question of nature in ways that would be new and different and challenging for people and thought-provoking more than anything else. Yeah, you're the easiest.
Oh my God. Thank you for the question, Amruta. Well, for me, as I said, holding on to my preferred idea of the coalition, what is marvelous about these kinds of gatherings for me is not only what they achieve in themselves, but also all the conversations and collaborations they lead to, which may or may not be connected to this event. But it's wonderful to see how people who meet at such gatherings might continue their conversations. New things happen, new narratives are produced, and the cause is then, you know, taken forward in that way. So I invest a lot of hope in those possibilities. Also, just in purely practical terms, I would honestly like us to share what has been put together and co-produced here across a variety of media, but also across languages. And this is a kind of a bee in my bonnet, the importance of translation, because particularly in roughly one of the domains we occupy in this room is contemporary art. And I've always been distressed by how very Anglophone this domain is. And I think it's vital that we translate a lot of our discussion here into other languages and address other linguistic constituencies. So this would be it's not easy. I mean, I'm not just suggesting this. I know, having gone through translation projects, it's demanding, but I think it's a step we need to take. It's not only is it practical and sensible, but it also is in accord with a philosophy of inclusiveness. So this to me is, I mean, it's a practical step I'd like us to commit ourselves to going forward.
So, I mean, the inspiration that comes from this gathering is also to kind of, in my own practice and learning, I realized that, you know, there's so much more to absorb in the other disciplines. And that was, especially today's presentation, when Rajshi was reciting those poems. I was like, there is so much that the social sciences can talk to with the humanities to bring in a different ideation around these issues. So I think there is that's something definitely I'm taking forward from these conversations. And I think what Ranjit was saying also, that I completely agree with him on that. How do you now transfer this back or spread it at a wider scale and kind of, you know, in different languages, and even the research we do, and I kind of highlighted it when I was making my presentation. It worries me that current form of knowledge production has all mostly getting paywalled in the academic space. And this is a big source of worry. And so much research happens. It's incredible how much research actually happens on a yearly basis. But where is the knowledge sitting from that research? And that is a question that I'd like to prod more in terms of how knowledge can be made more widely accessible outside these defined spaces, in the space that I occupy now, which is academia. Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand the question you're saying, what are we going to do next?
In a way.
With ourselves?
But how do you feel this will amplify in a way?
Well, as I said in the first comment, that the future I don't know. But what I do know is that every time I hear, listen, understand better, it impacts everything I do. right? Not just one thing, and certainly impacts the idea of what I do productively as work. So it certainly, but impacts my relationships with people I relate to, or people I haven't related to, but now I would relate to because I understand them better. So it opens up my sociability, my understanding of everything, and I think that hopefully will bring more sensitivity, and I also sort of encounter the limits of my ignorance when I listen, because one thing becomes abundantly clear, that there are layers and layers and layers and layers, and the perspectives and perspectives, and each one of them is equally valid. And to move in that sphere means that you move with ignorance, in a spirit of learning and listening and hearing. So I certainly would listen better because of knowing how little I know. But in terms of actual practice of what is the next work I will do, I think it changes the questions I ask. So I'm not talking the form of work. It can take many forms. Of course, like Ranjit has suggested, and of collaboration. These are very important political forms. And but I think the questions which I ask of myself and of the world, they shift a little bit. And to me, defining those questions is very important for myself, because I'm not sure I have any answers, but do I have the right questions? And I think that's a question I always ask. Am I asking the right question? And because to ask the right question requires a great amount of clarity of the field I'm in. You're traveling to the moon and you're in the open space. You have to ask the right question of what you have to do, which thruster do you have to press on to get to that right place. That's a very precise thing. To me, the question is a very precise thing. So am I able to ask the precise question better? I think I'm able to do it better, but whether it's the right question, only time will tell.
Everything I wanted to say. But I think in an honest admission, I think knowing that I do not know everything is quite revolutionary, personally speaking. Going to field, talking to people, knowing their worldview, admitting that I did not know this in all humility is sort of a great extension of what knowledge would do to me. But I think off late, and it's a question in recurrence because I'm now trying to work on my manuscript, and you get asked, one is going to a community to work with, what will you give in return to that? And I've come to accept nothing, except that I'm producing a work that is going to be based on an objective inquiry insofar as I have made efforts. And in the long run, what I have written, if could serve one person when they go back to talk about the same community, is a great success to me. But beyond all of this, I think sometimes admitting that if you are able to create a care network, which as in academia, there's this constant push for you to publish, and so you have to constantly externalize your knowledge in form of actual research production. But you also can be a kind person to peers who are in the same field and create a care network where there's a crisis of ethical care. So I think just a small admission to feeling that you're not going to change the world, but care for one another, I think is a great ethical imperative I feel now that's looking at me on my face as an early career in academia.
Yeah, I mean, I think for this institute to do this project over such a long time, I think one of the reasons was that in our own little way, we help people ask questions, not even formulate them, but just ask questions. And maybe that's where sort of some impact change begins. But as a last thing, I wanted to ask both of you if you had any comments on any of the panels or anything, any of the keynotes or the stuff like that.
Oh my goodness. because we've been so immersed in it, and all of us have been taking copious notes, I don't know that I can immediately process a series of thoughts, but...
Let me reformulate the question. We've been talking about this conference now for more than a year, and it went through different ups and downs, most of it beyond our control. So in terms of like the results of it right now, and then incorporating them into the next 3 years of the work that we do, how happy do you feel about it, or hopeful?
That I can answer easily. I'm actually really very happy and have great hope. No, honestly, I think what shines forth for me from the conference was I've said it before, but it's the generosity of the contributors. Every single speaker came to this forum with a great deal of generosity, sharing research, sharing ongoing work, sharing well-achieved work and pushing it forth, also with a certain curiosity about the work of others. And that, again, you don't necessarily have that in every conference. And I've been in places where, we've all been in places where people perform and, off they go. But here there was a tremendous sense that people were listening to one another, they were taking account of work done by peers, by people in other fields, mutual curiosity, there was a continuity of dialogue from one day to the next. And also we had a spectrum of it. It's not like everybody was in complete agreement and, holding hands around the campfire. I think there were quite marked differences of approach, methodology sometimes, even standpoint, but each substantially argued, presented, and really making for that spectrum of views that we'd hoped for. So I have to say, for me, this is, it really does give us much hope. And as I said, foregrounding these questions of multiple languages, and I don't mean literally a linguistic translation, but how to translate across registers, across perspectives, and it really embodies that ethic of mutuality that I think has been at the center of so much that we've been talking about.
So one of the purposes we had here in this particular conference was to bring in a diversity of voices who are not you don't necessarily find in the environment and ecological framings. So many of the people who are talking here or spoke here will not necessarily speak in what you term as an environmental or an Anthropocene conference. You have a certain kind of narrative which is anyway expanded, but still, and especially from our part of the world, you see a lot more happening in Europe, more a diversity of voices you hear on the complexity of these questions from European context. But we were very keen that the complexities of the landscapes here are particularly important and productive to think about futures. And the kind of people who were speaking, were people who brought in perspectives which we thought directly sort of reflected on this idea of ecology and nature without mentioning it. Everybody didn't mention the word ecology and nature, and Anthropocene I think was never mentioned the last 3 days. But everybody who said anything had something important to say about it, right? So I think this was the intention, because as I said in the beginning, this is where the nature question lies. It lies with all of us. There's nothing we do which does not impact or reflect or show us something more about this idea of nature, because this is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and we have not acknowledged it. So when we start re-acknowledging it, then we have to uncover the fabric of social violence, of architecture of social violence, of social exclusions, social hierarchies and layers which are unseen. Everything we talk about in the humanities and the sciences have a reflection on it. And especially when you talk of, India, and maybe that reflects South Asia as well, because most of the speakers were speaking of examples from here. Then look at the last panel on caste. You see so much writing on race and nature. Environmental justice movement in the US is based on race. But where is the caste and justice movement in terms of nature here? Except when Mukul Sharma and other scholars and people like Rajshri Goody bring it. So these are unmade connections from our landscapes. And I seriously do believe, and I say it with deep belief, that it's not only adopting terminology which we are presented with. It is time we assert the culture-nature question from a perspective, I think, which has a lot to say to the world, both in terms of empirical and current politics, but also in terms of possibilities of ways of being. So I think we have something to offer. And Ranjit and I were very clear that we want to offer something not only to us, but to the world in this question of nature, which is becoming ubiquitous. Everybody's talking about it, right? So I think in that space, I think it's a great beginning. There are a lot more voices we could have brought on, but it's a conference of 3 days, and people get tired and bored. But hopefully this expands the question to bringing in more voices in. And we need to have more active voices, because I think the way we reflect and the scholarship we bring is really important for the world to hear, really important. And you can see two eminent young scholars on both sides of us who brought in such fantastic perspectives in a thing. And this is the young scholarship I'm talking about. You know, I'm editing a book with Mahesh Rangarajan on new nature writings. And you see the young scholarships there, young people writing. Young, I mean younger than me, so no offense meant, but you know, younger than me, which is a lot of you. So I think you see the critical way in which they see the world, which has so many layers, which was not always present. And if I may say, Mukesh Sharma also critiques Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha in the book. Of course, you know, that book is a milestone, and of course all critics appear because books are milestones, so we must acknowledge both those things. But I'm saying this new ways of, incisive ways of looking into what we came to believe, and I think this is very, very important, because it's not going to affect only us, but it's going to affect the way this question plays out in the world.
Do you want to add to that? Or? Yeah, so I mean, I think that was, thank you, Ravi. And with that, we are open for questions or comments from, okay.
During this conference, and one of the works that has really influenced the way I look at life has been Foucault's work on liminal spaces in his essay titled Heterotopias. And I believe Rahul also mentioned it in his presentation, how grief is a liminal space between the living and the dead. And you know, liminal spaces are defined by Foucault as something that is otherworldly, extraordinary, disturbing, but also transformative. He uses this term called crisis heterotopias, where a lot of transformation takes place internally within an individual. So in a sense, this space, this room, has been a sort of liminal space for me, and also allowed me to have a sort of transformative way of thinking and questioning. And not only has this been a space of learning as a student, but also of unlearning, since there has been so many perspectives been put forth by people from such diverse backgrounds. So I would just like to say thank you. I'm so grateful for the opportunity, and thank you to everyone for making this happen.
My question actually is part question, part comment. So this concluding panel, I guess, was discussing ways in which this can be taken forward and ways in which these conversations can, progress and evolve down the line. From what I understand, there's this saying that information in the past used to be scarce, which isn't the case anymore. But now what's scarce is attention. And what this might be a naive way of putting it, or because I think I'm an outsider, I'm not an academic, I'm not an artist. I would consider myself to be an outsider to this. These issues, as far as I understand, as I have seen over the past 3 days, are largely relegated to academic and artistic circles. But the fact of the matter is, as per my understanding of things, if there really has to be a change, these messages and these points need to be, firstly, they have to be reached to a large audience. And I think you kind of alluded to that when you said a lot of knowledge is paywalled, there's a lot of research going on, it's not easily accessible. I agree. So part of that is, yes, this information has to be reached to a wide audience. I guess everyone's on the same page about that. But it might be a very innocent sounding question. But I think that's really at the core of, that question needs to be answered if something has to be really done forward, which is, how do you make people care? Because you can tell this, you can describe an issue to people, you can show them evidence, data, a work of art, all of those things. But really, most people don't care. They just go about their usual life. And I feel that strength is in numbers. So if something really has to be done, there has to be some way to make people care. And I don't know what your thoughts are. I know this is not a simple question. I know there isn't a straight answer, but I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this.
You want to go? No, you So I think you shouldn't have to make people care about what they don't care about. But I think the reason we are here today is that people have started, because this has started affecting our lives. So we can look at air pollution, for example. I was surprised to see that when I came in December, the air pollution levels in Mumbai were that of Delhi, and it's a coastal city. So I think what we lack is critical thinking, not information. So what kind of information? If you start thinking of air pollution as something we seem to be all caring about, or garbage, and you think about what it is, a little more critically, what is garbage? Who deals with it? How is it dealt with? Where does it go? Where does it come from? Simple questions like that, because that's the only way you can deal with it, because if you burn the garbage, you'll have more air pollution. If you throw it in the sea, it'll come back to you. Or it'll come back in the fish. So we know this through the information, that it comes back to us because it is not innocent. And so when you think of this question in a very simple way, and you can even say that, okay, I'm going to segregate my garbage, then what's going to happen next to it? And what's going to happen next to it? These are sort of immediate questions to ask. Or my air is really bad, but this driver who comes, where does he live? What kind of air does he breathe? So is there something to do with social class and air pollution and impact? Either sort of, or, if the waste picker is now recycling the plastic, then how is he doing it, So these are extended questions of your own life. And I'm not saying you should start from anywhere else, but start from your own life, because I think the question has become so imminent upon us. When I came here the last time, and I was looking, we were discussing the artists and all that. And I said, it's really surprising that in Mumbai, in a coastal city, I don't see anybody talking about sea level rise, because you have a coastal road coming up. And to me, it's a preposterous idea. I'm not talking politically, but I'm talking environmentally, that when cities are barricading themselves against sea level rise in the next 20 years, you want to go and make more roads on the coast. I just can't get my head around it. So I hope you will not get your head around it, saying, okay, forget the politics of this, but what sense does it make? The moment you start thinking your everyday life like this, then I think the question starts opening up. I'm not asking you to answer them in one way or the other. Or from what I read, the RA forest and the trees cut down overnight, and So it's a question, it's actually a very, very big question of, forest versus development. You can have reams and reams of things written on it. But you start asking that question and take it to the next level, maybe talk to a few people, you'll find the question, everything we've discussed will come home to you. That's how I started. I started walking the forest when I was 12 years old and walking the river when I was the same time and looking bird watching, and then things started changing and I said, what's happening? That's how I started. I haven't started from any academia or something. So I think it's a question which confronts all of us today, and that's the reason it's so important.
Just a footnote to what Ravi so eloquently said. I think it also has to do with the degree to which we neutralize ourselves to urgency. I remember at some early point thinking of, we're in this great metropolis, we imagine we're absolutely secure. This was before the attacks of, 26/11, long before. I thought to myself, what if we see ourselves in a science fiction kind of scenario as a military target? When you wake up and realize it's a city that has an atomic power plant, several military bases, we're at military target. It's just a question of turning your reality around to see it from a kind of a weaknesses and threats perspective. And it's a way in which you can really conscientize yourself. I think it always has to do with putting yourself in what I'm increasingly coming to think of as a discomfort zone. Because I think there's a way in which we are encouraged and educated into states of complacency. We just don't ask those extended and embedded questions that Ravi talked about. I mean, I offered a rather melodramatic example of the military target. But suddenly, what it does is, it takes you back. You realize that war is not something that's happening at some faraway border. We are on a coastline. We are on a border. There's something about, particularly this city, we are dramatically unable to see ourselves in our proper location. Now, this is uniquely a Bombay problem, I think. But, we've imagined ourselves as this great space of resilience. We are honestly not able enough to extend ourselves empathetically to situations of marginality, being vulnerable. And again, you don't have to seek too far. Look within the city, look within our own lives, and all of these things these linkages are very clear. Also, again, since I seem to be in memoiristic mode, I remember at Elphinstone long ago, every year Govind Nehlani would arrive. Some of us didn't realize he was Govind Nehlani at that point. He would arrive. First-year students would be presented with his film on Hiroshima, and we would be told about the dangers of nuclear war and how terrible it was and so on. A lot of people were learning about these things for the first time, or they had a kind of veil of ignorance snatched away. One way or the other, you suddenly saw yourself as participating, whether you liked it or not, in some world historical drama with real consequences. So I think there's also room for, to answer your question in another kind of dimension. There's a need for that kind of what, in an old-fashioned way, we used to call conscientization, to make people aware of these questions and urgencies, and see how you can intervene in pedagogy. It's no point just wondering what to do with these questions. See if you can go out and, make other people aware of these issues in whatever way you can. I liked really what Amitangshu said earlier, but it's the small things, the small transcendences that can be achieved in everyday life, not the grand leaps of redemption.
Well, I really don't have much to add to this. I was just saying that I was thinking that we always see and this is following on Ravi's point earlier, the environment is out there, while the environment is in here, through and through. And to have these conversations on an intimate basis with people, to have those intimate conversations and ask these questions. We are a society where we have always been awarded for answering giving the right answer, but never for asking the right question, right from the school days. You have the answer, you raise your hand, you answer, you sit down. So if you were to turn that around, and as Ravi said, ask these questions, that if a solution to air pollution is an air purifier, then what exactly is it solving? And we have those conversations with different people in our own vicinity. I think there's a lot that could change. Yeah, that's all.
But thank you for staying on for 3 days. It shows a lot of commitment on your part.
Do we have, would anyone like to,
Okay. No,
please?
it's okay.
You sure? Okay. So if there are no further questions or comments, I think that's it. But yeah, but that's already been dealt with. So, oh, there is. Oh.
Anybody in the panel can take this question. In the politics of nature, how do you see the challenges in the areas of right-wing and their environmental politics that is also taking a big space in our imagination of nature? Sorry? Right-wing, right-wing.
Great question, whoever has asked. Yeah, I mean, one way to respond to this is that there is a concerted effort across the country that's been made to constantly invalidate experts. And one instance to describe why that's happening, you can look at recent high expert committee led by Ravi Chopra in Uttarakhand, who had suggested, which is empirically done study long-term, to show how the making of roads would destroy and highlight environment. And yet, nothing was done. And out of this, so, you know, and it dovetails with your question. So indifference in some form is a violence, right? But there's also a systemic problem of constant invalidation of experts. And I think that's one way how right ideological formation is using nature as a site where experts are deemed as deviants of not knowing enough to argue. Yeah.
Well, I don't have a universal way of defining the right wing because it changes from place to place. The US right wing is not the right wing here or the right wing in Europe. So it's a sort of fluid little, but one thing seems to be common is the subjugation of diversity, of opinions, of thoughts and ideas and of possibilities, and increasing. And the other thing which seems to be clear is that there is an idea that nature needs to be capitalized across the board. So that nature is in the service of humankind, needs to be capitalized or converted into capital. Now, there could be many reasons why this is the case, because this ideology is not without roots, in a sense. There is an interest of some sort. But I think both these are ideas which do not really reflect the realities of what we were discussing over the last few days. And I think it's also surprising why, and not everywhere, but in some parts of the world, the right wing is what they call climate deniers, or anti-vacciners, for example. But you know, the right wing here is not like that. It's not necessarily climate. So there are various kinds of affiliations of tropes of arguments which serve some kind of historical sort of formations and racial formations which are there. But so I cannot generalize on that. But anything which, for me, anything which goes against the ideas of diversity, of social differential impacts which nature has, that it's not for the service of somebody, but there is an idea of nature with agency, in a sense, rights of rivers. These are things which I would defend. And it's also not necessarily the left wing, as we might call it. You know, he's historically been very environmentally friendly, or has acknowledged the environment as something which has been, though Marx did write about it, you know, in his early Marx, in the German ideologue, and talks about alienation and talks about, so he did, but in the workings of the left wing and the ideas of the left wing, nature has not been granted the place and the agency, I think. So we need to go beyond these classical categories and think of what is it we are trying to do here. And that's why I'm hesitant to sort of club everything with a unified right wing.
Likewise, I take a kind of a, if you will, a case-by-case treatment of how the right wing plays out in this. But to me, an important case in point is the way in which the sacred is approached. And I'd link that to something that I've been trying to follow over the years, which is precisely the discussion on the personhood of rivers. Because it seems to me, even in a landmark judicial situation, a verdict that came down, it seems as though we reach to the deification of rivers instead of an acceptance of the personhood of rivers. And that deification of the river, and therefore the following claim that we must preserve its sanctity and so on, plays easily into a way of looking at nature which has now been appropriated by the right wing, more or less. And that's a paradox, because on the one hand, they're busy capitalizing and monetizing nature through vast infrastructure projects, capital-intensive, brutal enterprises that rest on expulsions, and which actually completely distrain and destroy river systems entirely. So we fall again into that same pattern of hypocrisy. So I think we need to open up a ground of debate where we set these ways of looking aside altogether and see how we can restore a sense of the sacred that is, I know this sounds paradoxical, but that's much more rooted in human experience, that's diverse, that admits of many different tellings and therefore many different claims. Amitangshu's done work on this with a particular stretch of the river. I hope you'll talk about it at some point. I think what's also happening with the right-wing notion of the sacred is that it rests so solidly on modern assumptions. It rests on print modernity. It rests on the idea of the authorized version. It rests on dominant narratives. It makes no space for orality or for prior claims, the claims of the vulnerable. So if you approach a river, whose version of it are you looking at? Which are the stories, which are the tellings that you'll rely on? Who is it important to? I think you're looking at this system. It's a hierarchy of narratives, just as it's a hierarchy of material interests. So I think in each case, there will be a certain granularity about how you approach this question. Yeah, and yesterday there was a discussion about how, for instance, while we're reaching for myths to live by, there also are myths that are used to pursue antagonism and to legitimize annihilation. So how do we handle the sacred is a question. I would simply say we need to reclaim it at human scale, because I think the left for far too long made the mistake of rejecting the sacred completely. And that was a historic error.
There are these, talking of historically, sorry to come back in again, but the racial roots of the exclusion of nature in the national parks in the US, there are sort of racial roots to that, how that idea of exclusion came about. So there are very different histories, and of course we have colonial roots which were on different premise of why forests were fenced, as Mahesh Rangarajan writes about in Fencing the Forest, that for different kinds of hunting and revival, nostalgias of landscapes which the home never had, in terms of so there are different drivers to what these exclusions were. In the US they were different, but somehow today they become universal. We have forgotten these histories, that they're rooted in social histories and political histories.
So I'm just borrowing from the points that were made earlier. If you were in the 1950s and 60s in India, and you had a problem with the way dams were being built, what would you be clubbed as? And I have an example of a man called Kapil Bhattacharya. He was an engineer of the Damodar Valley Corporation, and he was a hydrologist, he was a brilliant scientist, and he said this dam is going to kill this river. You cannot go ahead with this. And he was the chief engineer. I'm talking 1957 here, 1955. He was branded as a Pakistani agent because that time Bangladesh was East Pakistan, and he was seen as a person promoting Pakistani interest. So some of these questions, and for example, a lot of Gandhians who protested against, the way environmental extractivism was happening were also branded similarly as agents of CIA. Dipankar Bhattacharya, a very prominent scientist in Calcutta, who actually discovered the arsenic problem in groundwater, for 2 decades was called a CIA agent. And his papers, he was not even allowed to write newspapers. So this question keeps changing. If you go back to history, there are people who speak on the environment often find themselves in this crossfire. So that's one point. And also this conflict is going on in a different, so because Ranjit talked about the piece which I had recently written in the Hindu on Rani Rashmoni. And Rani Rashmoni is a 19th century philanthropist from Bengal who protects a stretch of the Ganga river for fishermen who were being taxed by the East India Company. Now, I wanted to talk about how her caste identity played a prominent role in the way she was being excluded from our interpretation of her in history, and even at that point of time, how she was constantly reminded that she was a Shudra. When I wrote that piece, the amount of grief I got for telling the world, why do you have to go back to her caste? Why do you talk about caste? I think this is where the important thing is. We have to recognize that irrespective of who's trying to dominate or hegemonize the discourse, we have to stick to the evidence-based discussions, critically engage with these debates, and not shy away from them. And doesn't matter who's branding a particular discourse in what way, as long as you have your research in place, we need to speak up and speak out on it. Yeah.
Can I just add one more thing? I'm really sorry to come back. No. Since you mentioned Damodar Valley Corporation, if you go to the exhibition downstairs, there are 2 videos. One is a context-setting video from 1957 film television documentary on the Damodar Valley Corporation and how it's framed. Of course, as we know, it is based on the Tennessee Valley project of multiple dams to tame the wild river in the valley, but also that it is not made by any right wing. It is framed in the idea of modernity and technology as progress, in a new nation state. So, and the whole video is so beautiful because it's telling how, it's even showing the indigenous people, tribals, and they call them that, as how it will benefit everybody, not that it will be displaced, and how every problem will be solved by this. So there are so many framings and exclusions in the environmental connections that some of these neat categories of the right and left do not really fit easily.
Do we have any more questions? Then I guess thank you very much. Firstly, I'd like to thank Ranjit and Ravi for curating such a brilliant conference. And then to all our speakers, firstly for accepting our invitation, but then being so generous with your experience and knowledge and making this a truly enriching event. Harkat for producing it brilliantly. I think this was our first truly hybrid conference, so thank you very much. And last but not the least, to the audiences, both here and online. Thank you so much.
Also, thank you to Amruta, who's been the anchor throughout all these years, 2 years, 3 years now. Also, during COVID times, single-handedly helped install the exhibition and the Goethe-Institut, and everybody who's part of it for the forum provided. And also to our 2 co-panelists today, who spontaneously agreed to join. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.